So welcome everyone. My name is Tevin Laxer. I'm the director of the Sacramento Jewish Film Festival, which is sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the Sacramento region and the Jewish Community Relations Council. Today, we're going to be discussing the film Cooked, Survival by Zip Code, which is the 9th and last film of our social justice film series, presented by 5 local organizations: the Greater Sacramento NAACP, the Sacramento Jewish Film Festival, the Central Valley Holocaust Educators Network, Sacramento Faces Race, and the Jewish Community Relations Council. All of our films have dealt with discrimination, racial injustice, those who battle it, and they're intended to bring opportunities for community members to learn, have informed discussions, and take action toward lasting change. I'd especially like to thank 3 committee members who helped with today's program: Lynn Berkeley-Baskin, Judy Hyman, and Susan Solars. We have 4 amazing panel members today who will be introduced momentarily. The panel will be discussing the film and the parallels between the Chicago heatwave disaster and other public health crises, including the current COVID-19 pandemic we are in the midst of. They will also discuss the lessons and strategies we might use to prevent and mitigate disasters like these in the future. Today's program is being recorded and eventually will be put on our website. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today's panel. Lynn Berkeley-Baskin is a board member of the Greater Sacramento NAACP, and she serves on the Sacramento Jewish Community Relations Council. So welcome, Lynn.
Thank you so much, Tevin. So I am just going to proceed with reading our amazing panelists' bios, and I welcome them all. I'm going to start with Judith Helfand, who is the director producer of Cooked, Survival by Zip Code. I hope you all had a chance to watch. Helfand is best known for her ability to take the dark worlds of chemical exposure, heedless corporate behavior, and environmental injustice and make them personal, highly charged, and engaging. Her films include The Uprising of 34, the Sundance Award-winning and 2-time Emmy-nominated Blue Vinyl, which I'm sure we'll hear more about, its Peabody Award-winning prequel, A Healthy Baby Girl, and Everything's Cool. 3 of those premiered at the Sundance Film Festival with national broadcasts on PBS, HBO, and the Sundance Channel. The Sacramento Film Festival presented her short film, Absolutely No Spitting, at our 2020 festival. Judith's latest film is Love and Stuff. Welcome, Judith. DeAngelo Mack is Director of State Policy, Public Health Advocates. For almost 2 decades, Mack has provided trauma-informed care to the underserved in marginalized neighborhoods across California. Using this knowledge and his expertise as an organizer, youth pastor, and playwright, he finds creative ways to teach and empower youth and community. He takes part in My Brother's Keeper Initiative and American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma, and served as program manager of WellSpace Health's acclaimed Sacramento Violence Intervention Program for critically injured and traumatized youth. Welcome, DeAngelo. Julie C. As far as, let's see here. Here we go, is a professor of American Studies at UC Davis. She is the founding director of the Environmental Justice Project for UCD's John Muir Institute for the Environment. Her research investigates environmental justice and environmental inequality, culture and environment, race, gender and power, and urban community health and activism. She is the author of 3 books, most recently Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger from the University of California Press, published earlier this year. She edited the collection Sustainability, Approaches to Environmental Justice and Social Power from NYU Press in 2018, and has written over 50 articles and book chapters. She has worked for over 25 years with environmental justice movements, primarily in New York and Central Valley. And last but absolutely not least, Nailah Pope-Harden is the policy manager for Climate Plan and a community organizer in South Sacramento. She has years of community organizing experience that spans regional, state, and national social justice campaigns. She advocates for equity, inclusion, and authentically in all spaces. Nailah is leading an environmental justice collaborative governance committee to hold the city of Sacramento accountable to its climate and environmental goals. Panelists, we welcome you today. Thank you so much for being here. I think we're going to turn to Judith and just kind of open us up and give us some reflections about your film, just for a few minutes.
Okay, well, it's very meaningful for me for this film to be shown in this context and for the film to be included in this context, because I definitely made it as a very out white Jewish woman person. I mean, that was part of the reason I think, when we decided to include me in the text of the movie and for me to sort of be there in it, part of it was to be able to say to my community and to the white community, come with me and let's connect these dots, because we don't always connect these dots. We don't always do it from a faith perspective. We don't always do it from a white perspective. We don't do it because we don't have to, because it's very easy, or I don't know if easy is the right word, but you know, if you're not in the thick of it and you don't see it, and you know, the view in your city obscures you know, your ability to actually see what's going on in lots of other neighborhoods that are really close proximity to you, but maybe not so close. You know, they are by miles, but not by blocks, so to speak. It's just really easy until there's a disaster that goes and opens it all up for you not to really understand what's going on. And so when I read this book, I was in the midst of making this film, Everything's Cool. And we had decided to make a film to be supportive of the climate justice movement, to make a film about climate change messengers and how tough it was for them to be able to kind of get the word out and for them to communicate the urgency of the moment. And believe it or not, we did that between 2004 and 2007. And at the time we even felt like we're too late. Oh my goodness, we gotta catch up. This is gonna be old news by the time it's out. Can you imagine that? Now it's 2020, it's the same story really. But when I read this book, I thought, wow, talk about climate change messaging. Like, this story is the ultimate climate change messenger. And I had the same response that the author did, Eric Kleinenberg. I couldn't believe that one extreme weather event could reveal so much about the city. In that case, he wasn't living there at the time, he was in California, but his natives hit the city of his birth. And he knew that all those deaths really represented something other than just all those deaths. And he knew that those 739 deaths were not because of the heat. The heat just pushed everybody over, but it was really not the reason why all those people died. So I was sort of amazed by his thesis and what he did. And I thought, okay, this is the right way to be looking at the climate change story, to link the climate change story to what's really underneath it. And little did I know that 6 weeks later, Katrina would happen. And that what I thought was a one-off, which I say in the film, was really a new paradigm. And it remains to be so. And I think the fact that we're talking about this movie at this moment in time, and we're doing it not face to face, I would have happily come to your screening, but that we're doing it on Zoom because of COVID. And that somehow this story has so much to do with the underlying story of who's getting hurt the worst during COVID-19 and why. And that on some level, they're the same. There's a fruit fly in my kitchen. That it's the same story, just another different, it's just a different extreme disaster that pushed it all over. But underlying all of it is the ultimate disaster that I think defines our country, and that's structural racism.
Yep, absolutely. So well said. I appreciate you kind of bringing it full circle to that, Judith. Nailah, Julie, and DeAngelo, maybe Julie, I could start with you and say, how is this film related to the work you're doing? And how is it relevant to other parts of our community that is very closely related to your work?
Okay, as the introduction, said, I've been working with environmental justice movements since I was a student organizer, and came out, working on these issues. And I do want to plug the environmental justice in a moment of danger, not because actually all of the royalties for that book go to two organizations that I work with, Uprose, which focuses on climate justice in New York, and the Community Water Center in Central Valley. But that book has this is a very brief overview of the history of the environmental justice movement, and using case studies, which we're familiar with. Some of them are very familiar, and some of them, like Standing Rock or Flint, Michigan. Some of them are more kind of invisible, slow-moving disasters, which works well with the film. So I talk about the Central Valley, because that's a very different kind of landscape than thinking about Flint and the racism around water issues. And then I look at keywords for that, for each of those case studies, like, dispossession, privatization, and so on. But the third chapter is the one that is most related to this book. And it talks about Hurricane Katrina, which I argue basically opens up kind of this moment of danger that we're in. The chapter also talks about Kivalina, Alaska, and the Arctic Native communities that are already facing sea level rise. And we see that in Arctic communities that are U.S. based communities in Alaska, but also in Louisiana. Indigenous communities are already the first climate refugees within the U.S. And that chapter also talks about Hurricane Maria. And so I think that I always tell this story that when I talk about, I remember being an organizer in '96 and seeing the Environmental Justice and Climate Change Coalition talk about what a hurricane would look like in New Orleans. And I remember thinking, that can't happen. That's just a dystopian science fiction. And I think, that of course, everything they said is exactly what happened in Hurricane Katrina. And all of the climate scientists and the environmental justice activists have been right. Everything they say has been right. And yet there's this persistent kind of ignoring and like surprise that goes on. And I think we're in a moment, and the moment is where that level of surprise and naivete is it was never acceptable or possible, but now you really can't unsee it. And I think that the film really illustrates that well. And I put in the chat, for some of you who maybe added it late, you can't see it, but there's this really terrifying article about the shifting, about how climate change and COVID-19 are related. And part of it is the idea that sociologists talk about as the shifting baseline syndrome. Like, we just accept all of these deaths. These numbers become abstractions. And I think and Eric Kleinenberg is a colleague of mine, and I loved this book. But to me, what the film does really powerfully is remind us that these are not abstractions, these are people, and that there's a way in which the normalization of 3,000 people dead, the film rejects that as an inevitability. It retains a sense of outrage, and it resists this idea of the shifting baseline syndrome. That we can, it's inevitable. We just have to roll with it. We have to adapt in a capitalist way. And I think environmental justice movements have always said, no, this is not, you're not going to buy your way out of this. This is not a technologically driven, problem. Capitalism is not going to create the answers to the problem it creates. And I really appreciate what Judith said about, focusing on the structural racism part, because Ruthie Gilmore talks about the racism, and she defines it really powerfully as, the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And what I think the film does is really humanize it, so that, again, that scene where Eric's going through the possessions of the people who died, you know,
Right.
that just hits in a completely different way, and it takes us out of that realm of, you know, oh, this is an abstract, like it's group
Right.
differentiated vulnerability to premature death, and it reminds us really what's at stake here. And again, I think the film, without explicitly saying it, is really powerfully tied to the climate justice movement, and especially the idea of the frontline and fence line community. The idea that the people who are worst impacted and most impacted are at the center of talking about, of making the change and insisting, you know, that this is not just like tinkering is not going to fix this
Right.
huge problem. So,
Thank
and
you.
so I just want to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're spot on, and I love how you really brought it back to, you circled all the way back. So you both, Judith and Julie, you both talked about how this is also about COVID, and we'll talk more about that as we progress in the conversation. Nailah, I'd love to hear your opening remarks and how this is relevant for your work.
Yeah, I think this movie was more than relevant to my work. It's relevant to my life. I am a Black woman born and raised in South Sacramento, which is like the south side of every city and every town, pillaged and raped for resources and used and exploited. And I came to do environmental justice work because, I mean, I wonder actually what I would be doing if not, you know, a Black woman raised in South Sacramento. If I had the freedom and liberation to be able to not have to see injustices constantly and be angered by them. And so a lot of my environmental justice organizing is always rooted in how do I walk out of my house as freely, liberated, and safely as possible? And what are all the mechanisms that need to happen and all the systems that need to change in order for me to be able to just walk out safe, free, liberated? And like, what would that feel like? So I think for me, and the film was wild because I also have family that live in Chicago, and to see and just know that it is such a compounding feeling and issue. And we can talk about heat, we can talk about COVID, we can talk about Katrina, we can talk about all of these events, but it really is an issue with systems, and it really is an issue with racism. And so I am excited to have these conversations and excited to engage, because the more that we talk about it, I think the closer we are going to get to solutions. But we do have to move from just talking about it to actually, what does implementation look like, and what does equity look like? What does justice look like for these communities? And not just restoration, but what does justice look like for these communities?
Right, absolutely. I love your perspective of bringing, you know, equity full circle, and I know that Judith and Julie share that, and I certainly know that my friend DeAngelo shares that too. So I'm going to kick it over to him and give his opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Julie and Nailah for your words, and Judith for the film. I just first want to, I mean, we've opened this space, and I really do appreciate it, but I just want to first just name some things, or not things, but people. Claude Sanders, William Reedsville, Lydia Payne, John Kinziger, Joe Stone, Richard Jones, Jose Molina, Emilio Aguirre. As I was watching the film, and it goes back to a statement that Julie just made, these are people, right? We all do data-driven work and look at widgets, but these were the names that stuck out to me in a specific scene of unmarked graves or bodies of individuals who didn't have family, or whose family couldn't get to them, right? And so here you had all these caskets lined up next to each other with these names that need to be remembered as our ancestors, as the people who we currently stand on the shoulders of, the people who we do this work out of respect for. And so I just want to lift those names up first, and invite them into the space, and really evoke who they were and how they were. This too hit very personal and very close to me. in '95, I was a 15-year-old boy growing up in Chicagoland, right outside the Chicagoland area. I grew up in a city called Joliet, Illinois, and we can remember this time very, very vividly. There were people around us daily dying. We would come home and look to the news to see what the new number was. That's how real it was. And so a lot of things struck me in this film that was really, really, really well done. The total number of deaths, right? The calculated number of 525, but the true accurate number of 739 souls that perished because of heat, more so because of poverty, and even deeper because of racism, right? Some of the things that really resonated was Judith's push to call this what it is, and that's a slow-moving disaster, right? As we're preparing for the next earthquake or the next fire or the next tornado, there are people suffering and dying as we wait, right? We know that the current California budget, or at least 19 and 20 budget before COVID, was about $918 million in disaster preparedness, right? While communities of color are sitting on their hands, waiting for help, trying to do all they can to survive. The work I do is based on racism at the center of everything, right? Race being at the center of everything. We live in a country where you can't look past race. I know there are some folks who push that racism has ended and we've moved so far. I applaud you for believing that, but you are living in a fantasy world. Racism is real, it is prevalent, and it is rearing its head every day, right? People are dying not just because of heat or fire or earthquake. They're dying because of white supremacy, right? People who believe that they are supreme and either have the answer for everyone or don't want to supply the goods for anyone. And so I'm grateful for this film, highlighting, what's truly happening when it comes to natural disasters and climate change. Our organization works very closely with marginalized communities to lift up voices. And I'll stop after this. One of the voices in the movie, this stood out to me so heavy. It hurt my heart. It was a woman. A woman was asked if she was interested in having a mammogram, right? She hesitated and she shook her head no. And when asked why, she began to stumble to find the words. And she said, "I have too much going on already. I have too much going on already." You could see in her face, if you watch the movie, you could see in her face, she wanted to, take care of her health. She wanted to, be concerned about her well-being, but she had too much going on already. And so that's what communities of color are dealing with. That's what Black and Brown communities see. That's what marginalized communities are experiencing. We have compound issues. And when the floodwaters come, right, and when the fire comes and when the temperature rises, those compound issues are then magnified. And so I appreciate the film, Judith. It was masterful. It brought me back to being a kid back in Illinois, and really showed me, the segregation that was still, it was prevalent then and is still prevalent now.
Thank you, DeAngelo.
It's okay. It's okay.
Oh, so next.
I'm sorry. I'm having a crisis with my baby. I'll be right back. I have to
Sure.
let her know that whatever she broke does not matter. Hold on.
Okay. So moving forward, we have 2 prompts that we're going to ask all of our panelists, and we'll just have a few minutes to have a conversation with each prompt. And then later, we will have opportunity for questions. The way the questions will work is again, when we open it up for questions, we'll ask you to put it in the chat. So be thinking as we're going through this and be listening for the answers that already may be answered as we're discussing things. But I just invite you to think about things as we're moving forward. So I think I'll read the first prompt. The film brilliantly applies a racial equity lens to Chicago's heat disaster. We can apply a similar lens to other public health crises of our time, be they related to global warming, maternal and child mortality, police violence, food and housing insecurity, chronic illnesses, global pandemics, or more and more commonly, various combinations of these interacting. I'd like to invite the panelists to talk about parallels between the Chicago disaster and other public health crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic we are in the midst of currently, and not only parallels, but lessons and strategies we might use to prevent and mitigate these disasters. And before we get started, Judy, Nailah, I'll probably start with you, but before we go to the comments, Judy, could I ask you to put up that slide? For some people, it might actually be reminiscent and help prompt some conversation of the connection between the film, what we saw in the film. So there's the truck we saw in the film, everyone. If you remember, this is the freezer truck. And now these are the freezer trucks for COVID-19. So I thought it would be a good symbol to kind of kick us off. And I think there's one, is there one more? There we go. So this is in Texas. This is another COVID-19 freezer truck being loaded. And of course, going back to the film, we saw and heard a lot about these drivable morgues. So with that, Nailah, I'm going to kick it off to you and have you comment.
Yeah, I always, we know what the issues are. We know that racism is the issue. And I always wonder why we have to continue having these introductory conversations to pull the parallels. Who are the people? Who are the people who need one more statistic to finally jump on the bandwagon? Like, who are you? And I honestly don't think that you're my audience or you know, like, I don't think that you're the people I'm trying to reach. So I struggle with it a little bit because there will continue to be those refrigerated trucks for years and years down the line until we start to really tackle underlying issues. And until we start to have like real conversations about what solutions look like. And I always struggle, like everyone has their role in the revolution and everybody has a role and some, you know, spot that they can play to help move us forward. And I think we have to be intentional about that. I think we have to be doing internal work to figure out what your role is. I think if you are a person of privilege, you have to understand that means that you're giving some up. I mean, unless we're creating newfound privilege, if we have folks here and folks down here, we have to figure out a way to fill in those gaps. And we have to be honest and intentional about that and understand that instead of talking about racial justice in a doom and gloom way where folks are getting stuff taken away, we need to be talking about it as the benevolent community that we all hope to see one day. And we need to be framing it like that. I do climate change work for the state, and so much of it is about gloom and doom, but we're not talking about the innovations that can come. We're not talking about like, the new technological advances that we can make. And we're too busy focusing on the lack of resources or fighting over the crumbs that aren't doing any of us justice. This is a slight tangent, don't judge me. But I don't know if any of you guys watched Lovecraft Country. It is a wild show about, with Black protagonists, and you wonder what's worse, racism or like scary monsters built in the Lovecraft world. But I won't give it away, but one of the questions that they asked is, who are you uninterrupted? And it goes back to what I said in the beginning. I think about folks that live in the community that I grew up in, and I think, who would they be if they knew where they were getting every meal every day? Just that little piece of brain power. Who would those people be? Like, what would they have been able to do with that little extra time? What if their job was secure, their housing was secure? What if they knew that, like, at night when they go to sleep, they don't have to worry about dying because of heat? Like, how much as a people how much are we losing out on because we have folks in our population who are constantly focused on survival and not anything to do with thriving, not even focusing on how they can be a contributing member to this society, but literally, how am I going to make it through the night? So I think we have to really think of this in a more collective way. We have to think about what we are losing if we're not willing to have this conversation. And we can think about it in the most creative and fantastic ways and think of this new world that is equitable and just and safe, and then figure out what everyone's role is to get us there. So I think there's so many parallels between things that are happening in history, and I think they're just going to continue unless we actually are going to be intentional about shifting the conversation to implementation and action. And I'll leave this there.
I'm here. I'm here, everyone. Thank you, Nailah. I just had to close just for a minute. I'll be back up in a minute, bandwidth. So thank you. And Nailah, I really appreciate too some of the things you earlier, you brought into the conversation about looking at kind of how do we look at the approaches in a way that gives back and in a benevolent way, right? As opposed to always talking about, right, lip service all the time about recognizing what's gone wrong. And so, yeah, DeAngelo, Julie, Judith, chime in.
Well, I guess I have a question to my amazing colleagues on this panel, and that is, I mean, I don't know if shifting money from the world of disaster preparedness to investing in, the infrastructure in communities whose infrastructure has been decimated from years and years of redlining and strategic disinvestment, or just disinvestment, whether it was strategic or not. That's what happened. I just use the disaster preparedness frame because I do think that the language is very powerful. And I think, the fact that you have to wait to have a disaster officially declared in order to greenlight certain kinds of money made it so, I just thought that was so ironic. It was like, well, what kind of disaster, what do you need to declare the disaster? Like, all these people dying of treatable diseases every year, like Dr. Whitman in the movie says, 3,200 a year, that seems like a lot of people. Like, now they're dying like one at a time each day or 10 a day, and they're from different treatable diseases, and it's hard to get the number until the end of the year, perhaps, right? It's not like a one-off and you could count it within a week and then you get it the way we do with a heat wave or a hurricane, or the way that, you click in and you see how many people died today from COVID, and then you have a number at the end of the month, and then you could say which zip code got hurt the worst. I just find it so crazy that we use all this language like disaster, official disasters, unofficial disasters, preparedness. You spend all this money to envision a future horrible thing, and that people can like embrace, but they can't look at what's really going on because we have enough stats to do it. So that's why I did it, because I think sometimes it's for some folks, like you were saying, Nailah, like, who is it that needs to hear this? It's probably not the people on this chat, right? But I thought, okay, maybe like, since that's the language that they understand, let's use this language. So that was the premise in the film, that was the thesis. But communities declaring racism a public health crisis and doing that reframing, that has only happened in the last, in like the last year and a half or so. Starting with Milwaukee County. And I'm just wondering, like, is this the right frame? Like, sort of playing with the world of disaster preparedness and trying to reframe it, and then saying, well, how much money are we spending on that? What if we use that money differently? Could investing in local infrastructure libraries, and the kinds of organizations that I showcase in the movie, but that you all know, who became the frontline rapid responders during COVID. If we invest in them and we reconsider what they do to be disaster preparedness, is that a better idea? Does that make any sense? Could you run, is that, I mean, that's a tiny little sliver, but it's something. What do you think?
Yeah, it seems elementary, right? Like, you think about responding to something after that's tremendously catastrophic, right? When you could, it's almost like, if you know the levees are weak, fix the levees, right? If you know that heat is the issue, put in cooling stations that aren't in police stations. You know, give the people air conditioning or central air, right? And so we do, like, I think you used the words, disaster preparedness is a place of privilege, right? Like, when you were out and you were with the folks, they were all thinking about that because they're privileged, right? They haven't been hit yet. And so how about, we know that once the levees break, we know the populations and the numbers of populations that will be affected. Instead of focusing, I believe it's elementary, instead of solely focusing on preparing for it to happen, why not ensure building up infrastructure? Infrastructure being levees and the infrastructure of communities and people, right? We have the resources to do it. For me, it's dollars and cents. That would actually save, you know, cities and states money. But again, it goes back to words and language and narrative, and the importance of changing the narrative that fits, you know, the people. One of the things I know is that with COVID, we're seeing the way different folks are responding, refusing to wear masks and traveling and doing, you know, my rights are being infringed upon. These are folks that aren't being solely experienced or affected in their circle, right? These are folks who have privilege and have an area where they are able to do these types of things, and so it doesn't affect them. And I've always been of the belief that it's difficult for people to be empathetic or to feel the pain of another if they're solely, you know, surrounded by, you know, an insulated privilege. And that's just my thought.
I think, jumping off that point, and I think the one of the moments in the film that really raises this question of framing and narrative really well is when you talk to the disaster preparedness officials, and they talk about, oh, well, that's not our job. Our job is to just get people back to normal. And that COVID, I think, really is, raising that question of normal, normal to what were the normal conditions already that were unequal that make it worse, and so on. But when you hear people say it, and then when you hear also people talk about an inability to see or to feel, I'm not even just saying pain or the experience, but even just the life stories of others. I was teaching, I always show this film, Trouble the Water, about Hurricane Katrina. And my students now, they're first year students, they were 3 years old when Katrina happened. Katrina means nothing to them. And they've also sort of already forgot Hurricane Maria, which was 3 years ago, and I think that it was interesting because I have a place in my lecture worksheet, when I asked them to reflect on it, and they're like, well, I didn't understand before why people didn't just leave. But now I understand better. But it had to be through the story, because it's such a great documentary of Kim Rivers Roberts and her partner, and and so on. The abstraction was too big for them to understand, because I mean, not to overly generalize, but a large percentage of my students are pretty comfortable, and they come from suburban communities, and they don't know the history of redlining. Their reality and their life, they don't interact really with class or racial difference, other than in a really, and so I think to be able to understand the stories of others, and it was a really big moment for them. I mean, I cannot tell you how many people are like, well, I always thought people could just, when she said she couldn't afford to leave New Orleans, like that's when I realized, like I never thought about it. I didn't understand why people don't leave. Do you know what I mean? But, I think it's hard because maybe in certain traditions or families or in other places, you talk about this more than in a lot of other cultures or in other families. But I know that for a lot of in a lot of people's lives, they don't talk about this. Their reality is just is reality. Their reality equals reality. And this is where we see the, conflict around, COVID and stuff. It's like there's this inability to see the connectedness of people. And I think that, environmentalism is always about this connection framework, but the idea of like getting back to normal, I mean, I think is something that, COVID really brings to light that that's not really even the goal, right? Like who wants to get back to normal, And how are we the only country in the world where 14 million people have lost their health insurance in the middle of a global pandemic? Do you know what I mean? And so I think that what I really like again about your film, and I think most of the people already know this, but we have to continue to talk to others and educate others who don't like normalize a sense of connection or empathy to others, because I can tell you that's not, you have to be taught that and you have to learn it and you have to re-communicate that daily. We can't assume it. And, I think that the election makes that pretty clear. But it's both frustrating, like Nailah was saying, we're having the same conversations, but it's also necessary conversations that we need to always continue to have too. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah,
That's how I'm trying to think about it.
I think that's, oh, Nailah, did you want to comment? Sure.
Just, I'll keep it pretty brief. I love that framing, Judith. I think we have to start co-opting all of these institutions and changing definitions. And that's where it starts. So I probably will elaborate on it a little bit later, but with the city, we're starting a Sacramento Environmental Justice Collaborative Governance Committee. Horrible name, I know, we're working on it. But one of the things that it's mandated to do is we're going to look at how do we get folks in communities prepared for community emergency response training? And how do we, I think our goal is to get 10,000 folks. The organizer in me is already figuring out, okay, so if we're talking about community emergency response training, we should practice on if domestic violence, episodes happen. Like, oh, we can use those as great practices in the meantime. We can use the same resources in case there's, some type of issue with community safety or some type of shooting in a neighborhood. Can we like rework it and redefine, like, we're just doing the drills here, we're just trying it out. We're making sure that enough folks in particular communities are resourced. And how do we like play the game better as best we can until we can really shift the funding in a real way and until we can work on shifting some of the definitions. So I think it's always about like being nimble and creative and staying on our toes with knowing the rules of the game.
Nailah, you just oh, I'm sorry, Judith, is it okay if we move on to the next?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Make it brief and we'll move on to the next prompt because she just led us there.
Oh, she did. Well,
Yeah.
Is that a new kind of framing to get involved in emergency preparedness? Is that a new idea?
Yeah, there's folks in LA that have modeled it out, but a lot of communities in California are looking more into changing that definition. Yeah.
But then you have a right to say, well, you know what, we want to redefine emergency. Like in our community, emergency actually means this. So, I mean, it would actually push the infrastructure. They'd have to say, well, what do you mean by emergency? Wow. Well, then who actually addresses that emergency? And then, they might say, whoa. So the community health worker who's addressing the diabetes problem or the breast cancer problem, she's actually a new brand of first responder. We've never really thought about it that way. How interesting. I mean, I think you have a lot of opportunity there. That's great.
Yeah, and so this actually still leads us to the next prompt. So perfect timing.
Good.
So I'll read this and feel free to just, continue to chime in. Just 2 weeks ago, Sacramento County joined nearly 150 localities around the country and at least 4 state governments in declaring racism as a public health crisis. These governments are catching up with public health experts who have identified racism as a public health issue for decades. Sacramento's declaration acknowledges that the county should have a more active role in addressing long-standing issues of race. It mentions internal training and public education, workforce diversity and community involvement, disaggregated data, and reviews of policies and procedures. It does not, however, allocate funding or make any real changes to existing structures. We'd like to hear your thoughts or continued thoughts about the value of such resolutions and how we could use them locally to catalyze our work at the intersections of race, climate, and public health. And I would like in this moment too to kind of ask DeAngelo to chime in too with at some point in the conversation about what he's done at the city level as well. Anyone can chime in?
Yeah. I mean, I can start. That way I can be quiet and listen to these great people. But you know, there is this idea of action, like Naima said. I'm all about the movement and action, and let's put these things to work. But I also understand the importance of things like resolutions, right? Resolutions are statements that held by the right people, the right entities, put those who are in positions of power their feet to the fire. They cause them. They can be held over them to cause them to move. And so resolutions also galvanize the people who are presenting them if done correctly. I think what Lynn is speaking about here in Sacramento, we wanted to redefine what public safety meant to communities of color and marginalized communities in general. The definition of safety here was loosely defined as police, fire, and medical response, right? And so we got together with community members and, more importantly, young people, right? We pulled together young people over a little over a year's time and really had conversations about just that, changing the narrative. Like, what does safety mean to you, right? And wrote this amazing resolution that defined safety from our point of view. And it just happened to be the first of its kind in the country. It just happened to go before all of our commissions and be passed, and then in front of our city council, and unanimously they voted to approve the resolution. So Sacramento is the first in the country to have a defined public safety definition, right, or resolution. And so what are the next steps, right? All in our mind as myself and partners and the young people were putting this together, it was all in our mind, like, what do we want from this? But one of the things that I realize is sometimes we are asking things like, well, how much is this going to cost us, or where are the dollars going to be used? We have to slow people down and say, you first haven't even heard our voices, right? And that's really the first step of a resolution, is hearing the voice of the people. So often, again, like I said earlier, we people who are in positions of power, and I put myself in that position as well, speak too much for the people who are in need, right? And this was an opportunity for the voices of the community to truly be heard. And we wanted to just glance right past that, right? Like, okay, how much is it going to cost us? Yeah, we'll get there because we're taking your money. But first of all, let our voices be heard, right? And so that's what a resolution is doing. And for Sacramento to declare racism a public health crisis is huge, right? We live here. We know there's a history here of racial discrimination, right? And we're uplifting those things in our resolutions. For instance, we speak about genocide in our public safety resolution. And that honestly is what blew me away, because it unanimously got voted on, and everyone asked the question about how much money this is going to cost, but nobody asked what's the responsibility now for me when I have to adhere for the genocide that happened, right? And so pushing resolutions forward are very important as a step to move the needle in creating real change.
Julie, you look like you're going to say something.
Oh, I mean, I agree with DeAngelo, and that even though there's, that didn't come with funding or real change yet to existing structures, it's part of a process, and that DeAngelo has talked about, the engagement and working, centralizing youth voices is the start of that process. California, passed a human right to water in 2012. And so, once you have a resolution, again, without money, without funding, changing the essential structure, and yet community justice and water justice groups always point to that and say, well, how do we use this to move what we want to move? Protection for low income and, people of color and farm workers and, people with small water systems and so on. So I totally agree. With these big problems that we're talking about, I saw a phrase somewhere that said all hands on deck. We need it on all fronts in all different ways. So, I think that I don't think these kind of huge problems can only be legislative. They can only be cultural. They can only be, educational. I think it's all hands on deck. We're talking huge problems. So, I think it's one bit of, anything. We need so much work right now. So whatever people do and however they do it is what matters.
Yeah, I'll just hop on real quick and say, I think it's also about not necessarily finding new pots of money, but figuring out how we reprioritize pots of money that are already existing. In my day job, we're working on a campaign called Decolonizing Transportation Funding. And part of that is about how complicated and convoluted funding structures are, and how do we just make things understandable and accessible so that organizers, community groups, youth, everyone who's actually impacted can better address, because that's another issue that we don't always talk about, is just how complicated some of this funding is and works. And so even when you are trying to organize and advocate for your issues, it's so hard to understand what pots of money you have access to. And so I think for those who can and have the resources and the knowledge, being able to share that with communities so that we can understand, where should I be pushing and pulling? Where are the levers? Help me, show me, so that I can say, like, no, actually it is line item, 43BC that I'm talking about. That's where the money is, because that helps empower communities at a huge level. And it's not about finding new money. It's really just about holding them accountable to what they already said they would do with money. I think that's a super important part that I think we can start working on today as we find those new funding sources.
I think that some of the answers probably exist already, because the grassroots organizations who have been left to have to fill the gap to address the long-term impact of structural racism, and who've been doing really, really important work, whether it's with youth or whether it's with elders or whether it's around, public health, or whether it's around addressing food insecurity, or whether it's around really looking at what high-level equitable public education looks like. I think that, they've all been addressing the public health crises as they have understood them for years. And they put the words disaster and crises, they have attached it to those problems and to those statistics. So I think one of the first things to do is to sort of really bring them to the table and really look at who are those organizations that have been working at the intersection of race, climate justice, and public health, and how have they enlarged the definitions of public health by virtue of their work. And I think investing in what they do and helping them bring what they do to a certain kind of scale could be very, very, very important. But, you know, I'm all about, like, maybe you don't need the next new truck, and that truck that you would have used for the next earthquake, it's like, for the price of that truck, you could invest it in the community in a way that is going to address, you know, that is still going to be doing like the disaster work, and is going to address the public health crisis that is linked to structural racism. So, I mean, I'm really interested in trying to use this disaster frame as much as we possibly can. And I think that was the reason why, I mean, that is the reason for the public health crisis, right? I mean, the reason to change it that way is because they hope that someone would listen. Because if you torque the terminology and they're used to addressing crisis, then okay, I guess I'll address this because you put crisis at the end of it, but it's still the same problem, right? I mean, that was the thinking, I imagine. Oh, look at that beautiful baby.
Yeah, I think it's so important. You mentioned, you know, you put this in terms of narrative and language and how people use that to their benefit. And of course, that's true for budgeting. I do want to open it up for questions. And actually, I will ask my first before I open it up. In that in the film, I thought it was, and it's just more of a comment for you to also play on if you'd like. I also recognize somebody saying that in the film that the place that was open, the one place that was open as a cooling center was the police department. And I don't know if did that ring true for any of you? Because I was just like, what?
So resonated. And then had the nerve to say very little explanation on why people weren't coming to the police station to seek cooling. I'm like, you think, let's just be wise here. If we're talking about truly saving lives, let's do something for the lives that need to be saved. You don't put a cooling station in the police station where most of the folks who you police have some type of dissonance against your policing efforts, right? Like, I'm not walking into a police station to stay cooled. I will, suffer in silence until, the night comes and it's a little cooler. And that's a shame. And it goes back to what Nailah said about being innovative, right? Thinking of innovative ways to support people. And that definitely wasn't one of them. So yeah, Lynn, I was like, really? We don't know. There's no explanation to why folks aren't coming to the police station?
I remember after Hurricane Katrina, there was, all of the reports that were trying to figure out what went wrong. And there was this line at a disaster planning meeting. And again, these are professional disaster planners. It was like a meeting of like 50 to 75 that were city, regional, and national. And they were talking about, what to do for, quote, low mobility populations. People who were disabled, elderly, people who couldn't afford to, get the car to go out. And I remember reading the report afterwards, and they talk about this moment, and everybody just says, huh, and then they move on. Like they just skipped over it. Do you know what I mean? I think, if you ask us this question, we're not professional disaster planners, right? But literally that's their job. And that was always, to me, I was like, okay, that's their job. Literally, you have to think about that. And then none of them thought it was okay not to have an answer to that question. And then there's this like shock and surprise about how it plays out. Do you know what I mean? And so I think, we have to all, especially now in this moment, like refuse the normalization, of that, like that. I don't think a lot of us here on this call probably think like that, but if you're in rooms where, that's the conversation you're having and people are saying, well, let's just have a cooling center. Let's just have it at the police station. You need to have someone in the room to go, no, that is not a good idea. And here's why, and here's a better one. You know what I mean? And so, to me, that's always, reflects the inability to see, the inability to imagine a life where you could, not just get in a car and go, but, I think the justice framework is, look for the most vulnerable and start from there rather than your own position, if you're not that. So.
Yeah, great point. In a minute, Judith, did you want to chime in? I was just going to turn it over.
I mean, I want to say, since the 1995 heat wave, the heat emergency plan in many ways that the city has created, it's better. There's more cooling centers. And in fact, to speak to Barbara Brass's question, can you imagine the impact of using a library for a cooling station, provided it was accessible to the community? In many cases they have, but then the question really becomes, a cooling center is like it's the worst case scenario. It's the last resort. So but I think, Eric Kleinenberg went on to write a really important book called The People's Palace. And it's about the importance of public infrastructure and the importance of libraries and the role of the library in a community to be this sort of this super mega form of social cohesion, and that it's the perfect place to be a cooling center, and it's the perfect place to invest a lot of disaster preparedness money into, so that it's open for way more hours than it usually is, that it has really innovative kinds of support for people of all ages, that it's the place where there's multiple kinds of support and social services and all sorts of things that are kind of like grandmothered into the same space, so that it really does become a community hub. And then that's not a place to go to with your feeling embarrassed because you need the handout because you can't afford the air conditioning. It's the place you go to all the time because it lifts everybody up and it's a wonderful place to be. So I think it's figuring out those kinds of public institutions that address multiple public health crises with, under a big umbrella in very, very innovative ways that also address like the carbon problem and address food insecurity and address job training and address all of the things that make a community either really strong or really quote unquote vulnerable, which is a word we've gotten way too used to and is probably not a way that anyone wants to be described. But so but the cooling center is the last case scenario. Like that's not necessarily, that's not the best way to think about disaster preparedness, I think. I think it's investing in institutions that promote social cohesion and health in the biggest, in a broad sense is the best kind of disaster preparedness.
Thank you. Nailah, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I just want to bring us to today though, because we're figuring out how to open up restaurants and all of that stuff, but we're not thinking about public spaces and communities that were isolated before. Like there are opportunities to be pushing these conversations now that we should be having about how do we make sure that kids can, still socialize in a safe way, get meals in schools. Like we don't have to wait for the next disaster, or we don't even have to point fingers at like what could happen. Like it's happening right now and we need to find solutions.
Yeah. Really, really good point. And
I just want to say that this past summer, we did a series of events. I'm going to say in Chicago, but there's nothing in anywhere. But that we call Summer of Extremes, and it was specifically to try to imagine, well, what's going to happen this summer when you have multiple colliding pandemics and they're all on top of each other. So a cooling center isn't necessarily going to be a safe space if you're worried about exposure to COVID. Right? So it's like, that's the last place you want to be is on the inside. So then what do you do? And so that was sort of like an opportunity to both to look at the underlying crisis and then to also look at these colliding pandemics. Thank you, Kathy, for putting that there. Kathy is the engagement strategist that was one of the architects of that event. And there she is, she's waving.
Thank you.
But yeah, so it's a complicated thing to think about safe spaces to cool off when you also have on top of it COVID. But I think that really speaks to what you were just saying. It's like, what are the real problems like right now?
I'm hoping to give people a chance to ask some questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Judy to just kind of set us up and how the process is going to work. And then we'll field some questions.
Thank you so much, everybody. So we found that in such a large meeting, it works a little better to keep people muted because folks forget to remute and we get a lot of background sound. So we have all the audience muted, and we're going to ask you to ask questions in one of two ways. One is you could raise your hand and we will unmute you. And the way to do that is to click the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a list of all the participants. And at the bottom of that list, you should see a button that says raise hand. And that's how you raise your hand for a question. And then you click it again when you want to turn it off. And then the other way is, of course, you could post a question in the chat. And Lynn will be going through and calling on people and reading questions from the chat.
The one thing while people are gathering their questions that I want to share with folks is that I really think that what Nailah said before about, the climate conversation and climate justice, there's so many groups that are environmental justice, climate justice groups that are really focused on, joyful vision leading, culture change. And there's so many amazing groups. And so, I'm happy to forward some, and if others have other people to kind of build. And I think, again, supporting those groups is really central. Groups like the Climate Justice Alliance, Indigenous Environmental Network, California Environmental Justice Alliance, and so on. And then the other thing I want to share with folks, just because this is not a zip code issue, but it's the same spatial disparity question, which, this slide really shows, the global inequity of climate change. So the places that are least responsible are the ones that are going to be most screwed over. So in a lot of ways, it's the South side, of the, if you want to take the analogy from Chicago to the world. And, we have to really think globally too. And, I think it's, I just learned recently that the US was responsible for 25% of historical carbon emissions since 1750. So a full 25% of all the carbon that's ever been emitted is from the US. So this is a huge global justice, spatial, racial, colonial question. And I'm so curious. I was taking notes when Nailah and DeAngelo were talking about the work that you've done that talk about decolonizing transportation policy and talking about genocide in the resolution. So I think that's so important. And so I'm really, happy to be part of, learning about what people are doing in groups that are really thinking big. That's what we need to do.
I appreciate it, Julie, and I appreciate you showing the slide too. That's great. Did we lose DeAngelo? Oh no, there he is. He's there. You moved on my screen. So do we have questions? Do people have hand raised, or would you like to put it in the chat? Otherwise, we'll continue chatting for a few minutes. Aha. Ryan asks, will this recording be made available later? Yes. This will be on the site. Tevin, do you want to chime in where this can be available? Oh.
It's interesting. I just posted it before you even asked. I posted two things that many organizational groups have been mentioned by Julie and DeAngelo and others. So on our website, we're going to post not only this chat, but we'll post the names and organizations of groups that people can get in touch with.
Perfect.
So the website is there, jewishsec.org/social justice.
Thanks, appreciate it. So continuing the conversation, how do people feel? And I don't see anything in the chat right now. And Judy, are you scanning the pages for? Perfect. Thank you. I'm wondering, as we're moving forward and we're thinking about everything that you've said, and we're talking about these local organizations, and I know, Julie, you mentioned some statewide organizations too, but when we're thinking very locally, are we looking at this as a system, or do you feel that we're actually, kind of insulating ourselves in each subject matter? Are we doing a good job connecting?
ask you who the we is?
We locally.
Okay.
So, and anyone locally. So for those of us who work in community change, social justice, equity, health, I think that's a great question, Judith. You know, certainly health equity.
Yeah, personally, I think I think we could always be better, right? I think working in silos has been a thing for a very long time. However, I do see a lot of groups coming together and combining forces and really trying to enact change in that way. Like I've been doing this for many, many years, like all of you, and I can see the growth. And I don't know if that is basically because of the disparities that we're seeing today and heightened racism, this pandemic. It is actually bringing us together. I was joking with someone the other day saying I do more work now at home through this pandemic than I did, you know, in an office running around. And I've met so many more people who are collectively coming together for change. I think we are moving in the right direction. I know that I've worked for many years with smaller nonprofits, and in that vein, we have to get better. Because with our smaller nonprofits, you know, they're fighting for dollars, so it's difficult for them in the sense of trying to support, you know, without the funding, and our bigger institutions gobbling it up. Lynn and I are working through a fellowship right now and thinking about how we create greater equity around nonprofit organizations, really trying to focus on what a racial equity center would look like for Sacramento. Basically one that the dollars that are coming in, the dollars that we're asking, right? When they come, how are they going to function? We know that for many years, there are a few entities through the city or main state entities that funnel these funds, and usually to individuals, usually to organizations who are known or whatnot. But one of the things I know is the work is not always about being evidence-based practices. And it's at times practice-based evidence. And we know that the folks who are in the community doing the work are usually the best served to bring forth their healing. Again, voices and hands of those who are closest to the actual issue. We're always asking folks how can we stop violence? How can we build better health systems without asking the folks who are most affected what their answers are? And so I think in that vein, we need to get better about bringing those entities together with the folks who are already doing such great work.
Thanks, DeAngelo. I really appreciate that. And Nailah, you have a question in the chat. I'll read it aloud. Nailah, I know you're involved in getting public involvement in local climate change efforts at the city and county. Can you discuss that? And that is from Susan Solars.
I'm struggling here because I'm going to give 3 responses. And then before I start, just know that these are all coming from a place of love. The first thing I'll say is 3 things that probably don't even connect because that's how my brain works. But the first thing I'll say is I had a conversation one time with, he was teaching environmental policy at UC Davis. He was a professor, and he says, I struggle between wanting to teach the next generation how to write the most equitable, climate-friendly policy and wanting to quit my job and just open up a corner store where I can make sure kids, you know, have access to one safe space in their neighborhood. And so I think when we have this conversation about what we can do, it's a both and. And I think I often struggle with like, do we need to do this macro? We spend a lot of time doing a macro policy where we write a policy that says every kid is going to have free lunch at school. Or do we cook the lunch and make sure that they have lunch till the end of the week? And I think that was one of the points that, you know, you had brought up, Judith, in the film around, you know, being able to think about disaster preparedness is a privilege. And I think depending on where you sit, where your place of privilege is if all you can do is cook food for that week, then please, by all means, because there's kids and folks that need to eat today. But if you have the capacity and ability and resources to write the policy, do that as well. The other point I'll bring up, and this is where this comes from a place of a lot of love. These communities that we're talking about are in the north and south side of our city. They're not this mysterious place. While I appreciate all the times that I am invited to come to these places, it is just as important to find these communities and listen. And it doesn't, and there's ways to do that comfortably and safely. You can find folks that can help you and be like cultural brokers between the two, but it is not always about extracting folks of color to come and have these conversations. It's also about embedding yourself in these communities as well. And so with that, so that's the second point. The third part is like way more just basics. There are a lot of places to engage where folks can start amplifying and uplifting the need in our city climate action plan. On Tuesday, the city council is going to be looking at a list of first year recommendations. They're prioritizing $4 million, well, not even prioritizing. They have a list of $4 million worth of projects to make Sacramento more climate resilient and climate friendly. In that, out of $4 million, they're spending $25,000 to start an environmental justice collaborative governance committee. That is in no ways enough to really get into these communities and help uplift and get those voices heard. So your voice can be heard there. The county needs to be pushed. Unfortunately, I'm not as versed on where the county is, but the county is also looking at a climate action plan where we can really get some good community input. And I can definitely send the links to the folks to connect to for that. And then, like I said, we're starting up an environmental justice committee. And the goal there is to be able to house environmental justice work that's happening in Sacramento in one place. There'll still be a ton of groups doing a bunch of work, but we want to make sure that it's not siloed, and we want to at least have one place where you can go and then we can send you. If your thing is electric vehicles, electric heavy duty vehicles, and that's your slice of the pie and that's all you want to do, then we want to be able to, you come to us and we can send you to whatever your specific niche issue is. There's a place for you, but please engage deeply because it's needed and necessary. And those are my 3 points.
Thank you, much appreciated. I lifted up some things you said, and hopefully people hear them. It's so important. It's so important. We're going to go to closing comments. I don't see any other questions or hands raised. So if we were going to wrap this up, moving forward with this visionary approach, what are our next steps? In a closing comment, what are our next steps? Maybe even localize it. So Nailah, is this a good time for you, or should I kick it to somebody else?
Yeah, so
Okay.
I'm gonna drop it in the comments. We're doing a webinar on Tuesday to talk about the Environmental Justice Committee that we're working on, but there's also applications. I think what is most important is to fill out the application so we have your email. If you're not interested in being a part of we're selecting the committee still, it's gonna be 12 people. And one of the questions is 3 ways you identify. I'm not gonna ask you race, gender, whatever it is. You just put the 3 ways that you think are the most impactful that you identify, and then we're gonna go through an interview process. The goal though is to collect as many emails as possible so that we can start building out this database so we can get folks interested in environmental justice in one place. So I'm gonna put the webinar link and also the application link in the comments in a second. But those are 2 places where you can start to engage.
Thank you so much. Julie? Oh, there we go.
I don't know.
You don't know.
I don't know. This is a tough.
It's honest.
I just have I have a final. I have 2 finals and lots of grading to give this week. So my brain is not. I'm just trying to get through the week right now. But I'm just looking for a chance to keep on, sharing information and also learning from others. And so yeah, that's the least pragmatic one. But
Very
I'll
honest.
just be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And Judith.
Well, top of my thoughts are, you know, I appreciate that there's an interfaith context to this gathering this evening, and I wonder how important is it for these kinds of conversations or for these issues to be embraced by the interfaith justice community, and is that useful in Sacramento? Would that be useful in pushing things further? We are trying to actually, we're raising money so that Kathy and I, so that we can bring the movie to communities who have declared racism a public health crisis, who are now poised to try to put teeth into the declaration, because so many of them they are strong in heart, but just like you pointed out, like that new budget that the reallocation of funds and the way that it works from a budgetary perspective, it kind of isn't there. And it's like, well, someone made the declaration because they want that to happen, but maybe they couldn't go all the way. So they just started with the declaration because there's some very radical people inside that municipality that really want this to happen, but they can only push it to a certain extent. And then they have to be pushed in another way. So we're trying to figure that out. If that could be useful, we're happy to bring the film back and help you use that with leaders in Sacramento. If you think that's useful, we'd love to be able to do that.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah. How will the film be available to the general public who wants to see it and learn the nuances of the climate justice crisis? Well, for free, it's on public television on Independent Lens. It's the less than 1 hour version. I think the longer version is actually more nuanced. And that's the 75-minute version. And, you know, and that they can get from other ways, and we could give you ways to do that. But yeah, Kathy just put it, if you want to see the PBS version, that's the link, it's right there.
Thank you. Thank you.
But thank you so much. This has been so meaningful to us. It's very meaningful to me for the movie to be useful. It's exactly the way I want the movie to be useful right now. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to participate like this. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll move to DeAngelo.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Judith. Awesome. Amazing. I hope we can stay connected after this. I have lots of questions and thinking about this framework of slow moving disaster. So speaking of slow moving disaster, some areas that folks could, you know, get involved with, public health advocates, the amazing organization that I work for, we're moving the needle on how we reimagine 911 services, right? I love Nailah's innovation, you know, mindset. And this is definitely one of those ways is how do we look at that system a little bit differently? What we know is it's been the same since 1968. Nothing's necessarily changed, but we know that society around us has changed, right? So our goal is to, you know, run this statewide campaign on how we get cities to look at 911 and somewhat reinvest their funds into other things. We know there are definitely less fires happening than in you know the 70s, 60s and 70s, but there are still number, you know, of big rigs, you know, responding to park incidents or, you know, domestic disputes. And so where are these dollars going? We want to talk about who's making these calls, how they're being responded upon. We know that through legislation we're trying to pass, AB 2054, the Crisis Act, with natural disasters, it's difficult for certain responders to respond to certain things. And so we're thinking about how we get community entities who are well-known and versed in their community to respond to these different emergencies, natural disaster being one of them. One of the things that we experienced during the fires about 2 years ago was that our undocumented family sheriff's departments were going out to their homes and they weren't answering their doors, right? And the sheriff was going out to say, hey, we got to evacuate, there's a fire. And they were choosing not to answer because they thought, it was an ICE agent or they were in jeopardy. And so how do we begin to look at 911 and emergency a little bit differently? And that slow moving disaster is one of those areas that I want to look into. Also, if you're interested, we are really pushing, and I say we, public health advocates and partners, our CPEN partners are pushing the governor to create an executive order to declare racism a public health issue here in the state, right? And there's about 190 organizations that are on board, and we're always looking for folks to join this call. And so I'll put my information in the chat as well. And if you're interested in learning more about how to get involved, you can definitely contact myself, contact our partners as well, and we would love the support.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. So Nailah, Julie, DeAngelo, and Judith, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I am going to turn it back to Tevin in a second. I will also mention to Judith, to your point, we do actually have an interfaith organization that works on these issues. And it's called the Sacramento Area Congregations Together, SAC-ACT. So I would also encourage people to get involved with SAC-ACT if you're interested in these issues, especially if you're interested with using an equity lens and a Black justice lens for all of these related issues. With that, thank you again. I'm going to turn it over to Tevin to close us out.
Here we go. Thanks, Lynn. And I'd also like to thank our panel. It's been a great conversation, and I hope folks have enjoyed it, and I hope people have enjoyed all of the 9 films that we presented in this series going back to September. I wish we could be meeting in public in a COVID-free world, so maybe next year. So we hope that, and again, we hope you've enjoyed our films. Please check our website, which I put in the chat, jewishsac.org/social justice. We have there about, I think, 5 of the Zoom chats have already been posted, and we'll be posting this one in the near future as well. And a shout out to our Jewish Film Festival. We're going to be virtual next year in March. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go back to the Crest Theater for a while, but we will be virtual first week of March and perhaps even later than that. And that you can find on our website, which I'll put in the chat as well. It's jewishsac.org/SJFF. And thank you all very much. We really appreciate you being present for this chat.